Dyn ni'n mynd i wneud cyflwyniad yn ddwyieithog, so byddai yn siarad Cymraeg a bydd Ed cyflwyno eirannef yn Saesneg. Ac os ydych chi'n gweld fi jyst yn siarad yn dawel ag Ed, dwi jyst yn cyfieithu, felly sori, dwi ddim yn angwrtais, dwi ddim yn adnabyddu beth sy'n mynd ymlaen, dwi jyst yn cyfieithu ar gyfer Ed. Felly, can we stop the presentation? Croes Crist, Croes Pwy, fel dywedodd Sian, ac dyna adnod diddorol o'r proffwyd Eseia. Wrth wiro'r dde neu drwy i'r chwith, byddwch yn clywed llais y tu ôl i chi yn dweud, dyma'r ffordd, ewch y ffordd yma. Felly, da ni'n mynd i feddwl heddi am y dde eithafol, ond wrth gwrs beth ni'n mynd i ddweud yn gallu bod yn wir hefyd o mudiadau eithafol hefyd. Falle bydd Ed eisiau cyflwyno hyn.
It's really good to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation to come. My apologies for being linguistically challenged, but thank you for your patience in listening in English.
Ydych chi'n gallu ein clywed ni yn iawn ac yn glir? Yeah, great. So mae'n bwysig dweud ar y dechrau, dydyn ni ddim yn arbenigwyr am y dde eithafol, ond mae diddordeb ymchwil dda ni yn sut mae grwpiau cymunedol gwahanol yn dehongli y Beibl a weithiau camdrin neu gamddefnyddio'r Beibl. Hefyd, dwi'n gadair bwrdd the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence yn Coleg y Bydydwyr yn Bryste, gyda Dr Helen Painter, a ni'n mynd i cyfeirio at waith Helen yn ystod y sgwrs heddi.
I share Rosa's interest in the study of the Bible. That's what brings us together in this particular topic, but we also share that concern for how we live as a society in the face of some of the challenges that, at least in our time, we haven't really had to face before. And so we're very grateful for this opportunity to talk on this important topic today. I don't know if you saw 4 days ago the story that was released by Sky News. The title of the story was The Rise of Christian Nationalism in Britain. And it said this, and I'll just read some quotes from it. Bishop Ceirion Dewar rejects the Church of England as heretics. Instead, he gathers his flock under a gloomy sky on a beach in Cornwall. More than 20 people answered the call he made on social media. One wears a t-shirt saying Jesus is King. Another wears a Union Jack anorak with a t-shirt emblazoned UTK, Unite the Kingdom, which is the movement organised by anti-Islam campaigner Tommy Robinson. Dewar does represent a new type of Christianity, more militant, more political, and one that is on the rise. Several of those here came because they saw Dewar preaching fire and brimstone at Robinson's Unite the Kingdom march in London on the 13th of September. It was not Dewar's first appearance with Robinson. The year before, he spoke at another rally in Whitehall and said, "This nation of ours is under attack. We're at war. We are not at war. We are at war not just with the Muslim, not just with wokeness." Well, the message chimed with Fergus Worrell, who drove from Bristol with his girlfriend, Louise, and both of them were baptised by Dewar in Cornwall in the sea that day. Fergus Worrell said, "We're a Christian culture, a Christian nation, and I do feel like we've lost a lot of that." Well, Dr. Sam Wells, the vicar of St. Martin in the Field in London, responded to a public letter that was written by Dewar by saying, "It's very well expressed, but I think it's nonsense. I think they're reading a different Bible from the one I'm reading." We can perhaps understand his response, but of course the reality is they're not reading a different Bible. They're reading the same one. And just in case you think, well, this is England's problem, one of our own students just on Thursday of this week, who is minister of a Christian community in the valleys of South Wales. He said to us that there were two young people who came to church on Sunday, last Sunday. And the reason they came to church was they wanted to learn about Britishness.
Fel dywedodd Ed, roedd y rali enfawr wedi cael ei drefnu gan Tommy Robinson yn Llundain ym mis Medi diwetha, ac yna roedd y dorf yn llafyrganu rhywbeth ofnadw. Dyma nhw nawr. Yes, please.
Christ is King! 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 Christ is King!
Nawr wrth gwrs dydy'r geiriau ei hun ddim yn ofnadw, achos dyn ni'n canu o'r un peth yn ein hwyglwys i ni. Christ is King. Iesu yw'r brenin. Ond beth sy'n hollol ofnadwy yw'r ffaith ei bod nhw wedi uniaethu y gan yna, Christ is King, gyda'i fudiad dde eithafol. A hefyd, dwi ddim yn siŵr os ydych chi wedi clywed am hynny, jyst i ddangos nid problem Lloegr yw hwn, ond mae'n digwydd yn Nghymru hefyd. Felly, yn Llanafan Fawr, mae Simon Burkitt, rhywun sy'n rhedeg mudiad o'r enw The Woodlander Initiative, gyda cysylltiadau a Patriotic Alternative sydd y grŵp ffasist mwyaf yn y Deyrnas Unedig, wedi prynu tir yn Llanafan Fawr a wedi sefydlu cymuned yna. Mae'n galw y cymuned a racially exclusive settlement. A'r ysbrydolaeth am y settlement yna ydy Orania, sef tref yn dde Affrica ble does dim hawl i bobl di eu croen fyw yn y dref yna.
And so, what does the far right have to do with us? Well, here are some rhetorical questions just to make us think. Anders Breivik, you may remember, was the mass murderer from Norway who murdered many, many, many young people on an island in Norway. Why does Anders Breivik liken himself to David fighting Goliath?
Ac Alternative for Deutschland ydy plaid unwaith eto dde eithafol yn yr Almaen, ac maen nhw yn llenyddiaeth y blaid, maen nhw'n cyfeirio at y Symariad Tregarog.
Why do the members of Pegida, a Spanish nationalist group, carry a cross on their demonstrations?
Dwi'n siŵr eich bod ti wedi clywed am Jean-Marie Le Pen ac Oriana Fallaci, ac maen nhw'n defnyddio llun o Iesu yn cario cleddyf, o roedden nhw'n defnyddio llun o Iesu yn cario cleddyf yn eu gwaith nhw.
Why, in 2014, did members of the British far-right organisation Britain First invade mosques in Bradford and Glasgow and distribute Bibles to the Muslims worshipping there?
A fel ni wedi gweld a clywed, roedd y dorf yn canu Christ is King yn rally Tommy Robinson. Pam?
Here are just some pictures that may evoke some kind of response within you. The middle figure here is Tommy Robinson, who led the Unite the Kingdom rally in London a few weeks ago. This is a former Anglican cleric who was primarily defrocked because of making this Nazi salute, as well as promoting other far-right ideas. And this is Pastor Ricky Doolan, wearing the Union jacket, and who led some worship at the Tommy Robinson rally. And you can see some of the other members of the rally holding up the flag that says Jesus is King. So who are the far right? Well, historically, this term arose after the Second World War, primarily as a description of groups that were political and that were nationalist, authoritarian, and xenophobic. They were against foreigners. These days, the term is used still for political organisations, but also to describe intellectuals who take some of these views, internet groups, and in particular, a set of ideas. And one of these ideas that is important is what's called cultural racism. So in the past, these groups would have supported a biological racism. So it's the people who are biologically different from us, as it were. But now it's much more about what is a person's culture, and does their culture fit in with, in this case, Western values? So culture and symbols and codes of behaviour, they determine who is in and who is out. And both mainstream sort of far-right groups, as well as the more extreme hardline far-right groups, are turning to Christian symbols and to scripture in the way in which they communicate their ideas. It's worth just noting in passing, really, that the British government has introduced a new definition of extremism, which is another way of referring to far-right groups, but also, of course, far-left groups as well. And it's, in particular, an agreement to challenge extremist ideology. So it's not so much the groups first and foremost, but a set of ideas that lead to violence, but also to wider problems in society: violence, hatred, intolerance.
Sorry, mae yna camgymeriad ar y sgrin dal i ddweud crefydd mewn gwleidyddiaeth cyffredinol. Ond y syniad yma, beth sydd wedi digwydd, fel dywedodd Ed, ar ôl yr ail ryfel byd, roedd y dde eithafol wedi cael eu cysylltiedi gyda gwleidyddiaeth eithafol. Ond beth sy'n digwydd nawr, mwy a mwy, ydy ein bod ni'n gweld y syniadau yma yn y gwleidyddiaeth cyffredinol, mainstream, fel petai. Felly, dyn ni'n gweld mewn llawer o wledydd Ewrop, ond dim Prydain eto, pleiddiau dde Cristnogol. Wrth gwrs, mae yna hanes o genedlaetholdeb Cristnogol yn Cymru, achos arweinydd cyntaf Plaid Cymru oedd yn weinydd o gyfydyddwyr, ac mae cwestiwn enfawr yna o oes mwy nag un fath o genedlaetholdeb. Ond cwestiwn i ddiwrnod arall yw hwn. Ar diwedd y sgwrs, ni'n mynd i sôn am sgwrs gan Rhys Lloyd. Ni'n mynd i just cyffwrdd ar pwnc yma. Ond wrth alw am Brexit, dywedodd Nigel Farage, my country is a Judeo-Christian country, so we've got to start standing up for our values. Ac efallai, dydy hi ddim yn meddwl bod Nigel Farage yn mainstream, ond wrth gwrs mae'n dod yn fwy mainstream ar hyn o bryd, gyda ni wedi gweld beth digwyddodd yn Caerphilly gyda Reform. Nigel Farage eto, in a Christian manifesto ar gyfer UKIP in 2015, mae'n dweud mae angen arnom a much more muscular defence of our Christian heritage and our Christian constitution. Ours is fundamentally a Christian nation. UKIP is the only major political party left in Britain that still cherishes our Judeo-Christian heritage. Dim y beth sy'n peryglus, ond ydy just dweud dim ond UKIP sy'n gwerthfawrogi gwerthoedd Cristnogol. Ac wedyn, Michael Gove. Gwnaeth Michael Gove gyfiawnhau Brexit fel safbwynt protestannaidd, a dywedodd bod e wedi seilio ar etheg yr unigolyn. Yr un etheg oedd wedi arwain yr ymerodraeth Brydeinig a brwydro yn erbyn y Catholigion yn Ewrop, yn lle etheg gymunedol. Felly, dyn ni'n gweld yn fwy syniadau oedd wedi cael eu cysylltu gyda'r de eithafol yn y gwleidyddiaeth cyffredinol.
And so we see here that Christianity is being made use of to promote a particular political agenda. And it's much more really about belonging than it is about particular beliefs. So does a person belong within a particular culture, a particular country? Well, the religion is a way of determining that. So it's seen as an identity, and you may have picked it up in the quotations and stories we've already told, that Christianity is often seen as a native religion. In other words, what is the native religion of people in Britain? It's Christianity, and therefore, if you're not following Christianity, and perhaps a particular kind of Christianity, then you're not a proper native. Another aspect where religion is used within far-right ideology is the idea of Islam as a threat. In other words, Islam is not seen as something that is in some way intrinsic to people who are part of British society, even though they may have been born there and perhaps their parents born here, but rather it is seen as something that is from outside. It is non-native, and it is something that needs to be opposed, because the idea is that these things cannot exist together. And then there is a narrative of persecution. And so we will have seen stories on the news over the years. Sean mentioned the wearing of the cross, and people who, Christians who got into difficulty from wearing symbols of their faith. And this is then picked up as an indication that Christianity, and Christians in particular, are being persecuted within British society. Now, it may well be that some of these ideas are not exactly unfamiliar to you. And it may well be that you have heard some of these ideas expressed in your church. And part of our reason for doing this is not because of the threat of far-right groups, because in reality, the numbers are not that huge. But it is the fact that in our ordinary churches and chapels, actually, many people will believe one or more of these ideas. And this is therefore shaping not just their way of understanding Christianity, but also their way of engaging in society as a whole.
So ni wedi paratoi cwestiynau i'w drafod. Ni'n gobeithio bydd amser ar diwedd y sgwrs i cael hydig bach o drafod a gofyn cwestiynau ac yn y blaen. Ond ni'n mynd i cyflwyno cwestiynau nawr ac jyst i roi amser i hi feddwl amdanynt. Ac os ydych chi eisiau rhoi rhyw ateb yn y chat, croeso mawr i hi wneud os ti'n gallu gwneud hynny. Ac wedyn, ni'n gallu trafod y sylwad ar diwedd y sgwrs. Ydy hynny'n iawn, Sian? Dwi ddim yn gallu gweld Sian, ond... Ie,
dwi'n siŵr bod hynny'n berffaith iawn.
Good, okay. So, cwestiwn cyntaf, please. Cwestiwn enfawr, beth yw crefydd? Felly, jyst rhywbeth i feddwl amdano, achos fel dywedodd Hannah Stroman, a ni'n mynd i ddod yn ôl i Hannah Stroman mewn munud, mae hi'n dweud, simply stating that these, sef beth mae'r gwleidyddion yn dweud am crefydd, are superficial illusions that don't have anything to do with real religion, is to operate with a number of unexamined normative assumptions about what religion is. Okay, so beth yw crefydd? Ac wedyn, who can and who can't lay claim to Christianity and its scripture? So cwestiwn nesaf wedyn, pwy sy'n berchen a Cristnogaeth? Ydy Cristnogaeth yn perthyn i'r gweinidogion, i'r pab, y diaconiad, i ni sy'n mynd i'r capel bob Sul, i pobl sy'n galw eu hunain yn Cristnogion ond ddim yn mynd i'r eglwys? Pwy sy'n berchen ar Cristnogaeth? Pwy sy'n gyda'r hawl i ddiffinio beth yw Cristnogaeth? Pwy sy'n cael defnyddio eu hysgrythurau? Achos fel ni wedi gweld, mae pobl yn dehongli y Beibl mewn ffyrdd wahanol, a ni'n mynd i edrych hefyd nes ymlaen yn hynny. Ac wedyn, cwestiwn i hi bod y diddordeb da ni'n gwybod ar diwedd y sesiwn, ydych chi wedi dod o'r syniadau hyn yn eich eglwys i chi? Y syniad o native Christianity, Cristnogaeth frodorol, bygythiad Islam, ydy Islam yn bygwth ein ffordd o fyw yma, a hefyd y narratif yma, ein bod ni'n cael ein herlyd, oherwydd ein bod ni'n Cristnogion, does dim hawl da ni wisgo croes neu weddio mewn ysbytai ac yn y blaen. So dyma jyst cwestiynau i'w trafod a i'w meddwl amdanynt yn ystod gweddill o sgwrt, ni ddim wedi gorffen eto.
Sorry. So there are two ideas that particularly seem to be associated with the far right and the kind of passages that are used from the Bible, which are used within a far right ideology. And we should say that obviously the Bible is not the only influence sort of on far right ideas. We've seen people wearing Christ is King with a Christ is King banner. We've seen all the cross being used. So it's not just
Crusader cross.
Crusader cross, exactly. And it's not just the Bible, but our particular interest is the Bible. And so that's what we're going to talk about for a few minutes. One of the ideas that is picked up is this idea of war. And of course, in the Old Testament in particular, we see a lot of warfare language. And Hannah Stroman, who was quoted from on the previous slide, she talks about what she considers to be the war Bible. And it's using biblical text to legitimate violence. And in part, that would be especially thinking about the way in which the Bible was used during the medieval Crusades, as well as in the First World War. And certainly Anders Breivik, who we mentioned before, a far-right mass murderer, he drew on uses of the Bible that seemed to support violence. And probably you can think of many texts that one might turn to in the Bible to support a violent warfare point of view.
Yeah. Ac wedyn, y syniad arall ydy syniad o gwareiddiad, sef trefn, really. Y syniad bod Cristnogaeth ac yn enwedig y Beibl a'r holl orchmynion yn y Beibl Cristnogol, maen nhw'n ffurfio sail ein gwareiddiad ni yn y gorllewin, ac maen nhw'n helpu ni cadw trefn ar ein cymdeithas. A'r ofyn, mae rhai pobl o de eithafol yn codi ydy'r syniad, os ydyn ni'n colli y Beibl, byddwn ni'n colli ein trefn, ein gwareiddiad. A maen nhw'n defnyddio y syniad yma fel esgus i wrthod Islam a bobl o grefyddau eraill. Felly mae'r dau syniad gyda'i gilydd, y syniad o ryfel gyfiawn yn enw Duw, a'r syniad o amddiffyn ein gwareiddiad, ein trefn ni rhag syniadau o dramor yn bwerus iawn iawn.
And so Hannah Stroman's point is that it's not that people are reading a different Bible from others, but it's rather that, if I may put it this way, they don't have the traditional Christian knowledge in how to work with biblical texts. And we could say, well, that's the church's fault, because we haven't done a good enough job in teaching others, let alone teaching ourselves, in how to read the Bible well. We will all be aware of the lovely quotations that we use as some kind of proof text for how it is that we should live. But there is a problem with that, and we want to illustrate that now.
Mae'r Beibl yn testyn gymleth. Felly, os ydyn ni'n enghraifft, cymryd yr adnod yma o y lethr at yr Effesiaid, gweddiwch droso fi hefyd. Nawr, dyn ni'n meddwl, taw Paul sy'n ysgrifennu y geiriau yma, ac mae'n amhosib i ni ifryddhau y gorchymyn yma. Pam? Achos bu farw Paul blynyddoedd yn ôl, felly fydde ddim yn gwneud synwyr i weddio dros Paul. Felly dyma enghraifft syml o orchymyn clir a dydyn nhw ddim yn gallu ei ifryddhau nawr, ac wrth gwrs bydd neb yn ein disgwyl i ni wneud.
Well, here we have a Bible verse that appears multiple times in the letters of the New Testament. Greet one another with a holy kiss. Now, I know it's rather difficult to do that online, but if we were meeting in person, I have my doubts that anybody would have greeted me with a holy kiss. What would we have done? We would have probably shaken hands, or those who knew each other well, perhaps given each other a hug. And so why don't we greet one another with a holy kiss when it is a clear and multiply repeated command of Scripture? Well, we say to ourselves, well, of course, that's not part of our culture. We do something else. But in doing something else, we're interpreting this text and saying this is not relevant in the exact form in which it is given. We are reinterpreting it to mean something else within our culture.
Nawr, mae sawl cot gyda fi. Mae cot D dwi'n gwisgo'r gyfran gladdau. Mae cot hyfryd a trwchus dwi'n gwisgo pan dwi'n sefyll wrth y drws yn y tabernacl i croesawu pobl bore Sul. Ac wedyn mae cot ysgafn dwi'n defnyddio yn yr haf pan fydd yn bwrw glaw. Ond, ddim yn beth dywedodd Iesu. Os oes gennych chi ddwy got, rhowch un ohonyn nhw i berson tlawd sydd heb un o gwbl. Nawr, dwi ddim yn siŵr faint ohonoch chi sydd gyda mwy nag un cot. Dwi'n siŵr bod mwy afrif ohonoch chi gyda mwy nag un cot. Felly, pam ydyn ni'n dewis i anwybyddu gorchymyn clir Iesu fan hyn? Wel, fel dywedodd Ed, un beth dyn ni'n gwneud, dyn ni'n dewis i dehongli yr egwyddor. Felly, dwi'n gallu dweud, wel, mae mwy nag un cod gyda fi, ond dwi'n gallu rhoi arian i'r ganolfan glid i helpu bobl digartre. Dwi'n gallu prynu bwyd iddyn nhw ac yn y blaen. Ond mae'n bwysig iawn i ni fod yn glir. Dyn ni'n dehongli y gorchymyn. Dyn ni'n cymryd yr addysg ethegol a dydyn ni ddim yn ei ddilyn yn llythrennol. Dyn ni'n ei ddehongli. Ac felly, mae bwysig i ni fod yn glir am hynny, achos mae rhai pobl sy'n dweud, dwi ddim yn dehongli'r Beibl, dwi just yn ei fyddhau. Wel, mae'n amhosib. Mae bob un ohonom yn dehongli'r Beibl ar sawl lefel.
So here we have three examples of where we are interpreting the text for today, and we're not even giving it a second thought. We're just doing it automatically. But that's not an obvious thing to do. If you're not brought up within the church and the ideas of the church, then the Bible seems to be giving clear commands that should be followed. And that becomes very serious when we look at certain passages of the Bible, such as the conquest of Canaan. We won't spend too long on this, but we just want to illustrate that if you like, advocate for some training in how we read the Bible. So if we were to read the book of Joshua, what we have is essentially the destruction of all of the cities of Canaan and the deaths of many, many people. That's a very clear example that can be taken by those who wish to do so, to say, well, look, here we have in the Bible the command of God to drive out those who are different from us, and to do so with violence, even to the point of killing people. Well, there have been a number of responses by Christians trying to, if you like, explain away difficult texts like this. One is that, well, they deserved it. They deserved it. This is a legitimate judgment, but we, of course, shouldn't reproduce it. Another would be to say, oh, well, the people that were actually fighting for God rather than for themselves. And so they're not trying to get personal gain, so that makes it okay. Or some people would even say, well, this idea of herem, of killing, that's what it appears to be, but it doesn't actually mean killing. It might just mean devotion to God. Or then another explanation would be, well, they just thought God ordered it, but God didn't really. Or then again, maybe this is just imagery that is describing some kind of new creation. Well, these are all quite sophisticated ideas. They're not ones that immediately arise out of the text itself. But we can read the text, and the text actually helps us to understand it. Because although we have the book of Joshua describing the events as we just saw them, in the book of Judges, just next to the book of Joshua, we seem to have something different. So it seems to describe ongoing battles with the people who Joshua says were all killed. It seems to be between individual tribes rather than the whole of the people of Israel. It seems to be that it's led by different people rather than one sort of divinely appointed leader who leads people to this genocide. And moreover, it describes battles that are sometimes won, but also sometimes alliances are made. In other words, it's a very different picture from the book of Joshua, and there it is, right in the Bible itself. In other words, the Bible itself invites us to read this Joshua text in a different way.
Mae Ed a fi, da ni'n dysgu modiwl yn Prifysgol Caerdydd am hermeneutics, ffyrdd o darllen a dehongli y Beibl. A bob tro da ni'n defnyddio y llun yma. So beth da chi'n gweld yn y llun yma ydy Reino, a mae Reino yn tynnu llun o'r dirwedd, ond beth mae'n rhoi ar ganol y llun ydy corn. Wel, chi a fi, da ni'n gwybod, dydy'r corn ddim yna yn y tirwedd, yn y cefn gwlad, ond mae'r Reino yn gweld y corn. Dydy e ddim yn gwybod bod y corn yn rhan o'i gorffef, ond dydy Reino ddim yn gallu tynnu llun heb gweld y corn yn canol y llun. Ac wrth gwrs mae'r corn yn cynrychioli ein syniadau ni, ein cefndir ni, popeth ni wedi ei ddysgu heb sylweddoli, popeth sy'n ffurfio ein syniadau a'n meddyliau ni. A dydy ddim yn gallu ynwybyddu ein corn ni, achos mae corn gyda bob un ohonom, ac mae'n bwysig i ni dod yn fwy o ymwybodol o'r corn yna. A dyma beth ni'n ceisio wneud trwy rhoi y sgwrs yma, just helpu bobl i weld y corn.
So we've talked there about one particular aspect of this, which is how people engage with the Bible. And part of our calling is to try to help people with this. But what about all of us? What can we do? Well, Helen Painter, who was mentioned before, who is the leader of the Centre for the Study of the Bible and Violence that Rosa chairs, she and her colleague Maria Power wrote a book that we'll refer to on the screen in a minute, but in it they came up with 10 things that perhaps we can do by way of response, and we want to go through these as we come to an end. The first is that we who are Christians need to speak humbly. The reality is that Christianity down through the ages has provided plenty of examples that those who wish to pursue violence and those who wish to divide society can draw on to say, well, look, this is what our forebears did. And so we need to speak humbly about what Christianity has to offer within this discussion.
Ar ail beth, does dim amheuaeth amdani fel dilynwyr Iesu, mae rhaid i ni wrthod trais. Ac os oes mynediad da ni i arweinwyr, mudiadau Cristnogol, arweinwyr enwadau, mae rhaid i ni cysylltu â nhw a just annog nhw i sefyll yn erbyn trais.
One of the ways in which we can help, particularly from the pulpit, is to avoid stereotypes. So when we talk about Muslim nations or Muslim people as being undemocratic, as if somehow Christian nations have got democracy all sewn up, then we're painting an unhelpful and inaccurate stereotype. Similarly, saying that, well, the problem with racism is all with the white working class, it simply isn't true. And so we need to avoid sort of stoking the fires of division by avoiding these kinds of stereotypes.
A hefyd, mae rhaid i ni annog ein gilydd i creu, i ganiatáu ein heglwysi fod yn llefydd ble mae pobl yn gallu trafod, a gallu ddysgu i drafod gyda pobl sy'n anghytuno gyda nhw, heb cwmpo mas gyda nhw. A dyma cyfraniad mae'r eglwysi'n gallu wneud i'r cymdeithas, bod yn llefydd ble mae'n posibl i drafod syniadau gwahanol.
Be curious, which I would guess is all of us, because that's why we're here. But it is to recognize that actually these things are complicated. You might have seen when there was the Unite the Kingdom rally in London, there was a news item on a coach that had been arranged by a pub in South Wales to take people to it. And listening to them talk about why is it that they went. It wasn't that they were completely signed up to a far-right agenda, but they just felt that nobody was listening to them. And here were some people who were shouting and making a noise, and they wanted to add their voice to that. So the whole background to this is complicated. It can't be summed up in a few minutes as we've sought to do, and so we need to be curious.
So fel mae Ed yn dweud, dydy pobl ddim yn ymuno â mudiadau eithafol oherwydd eu bod nhw'n bobl drwg. Maen nhw'n ymuno gyda nhw am sawl reswm cymhleth ac yn aml iawn oherwydd clodi, oherwydd dydyn nhw ddim yn gallu ffeindio gwaith, oherwydd dydyn nhw ddim yn gallu ymdopi gyda'r newidiadau yn eu cymdeithas nhw. Ac felly mae rhaid i ni mynd i'r afael ag achosion y problemau yn ein cymdeithas ni, a nid jyst trin y symptomau.
we need to be prophetic as the people of Christ, and so demonstrate the same radical love that Christ did. We can't get drawn into, as it were, fighting fire with fire, but rather demonstrating a different and a better way.
Ac wedyn mae symudiadau eithafol a pheryglis yn treulio llawer o arian I radicaleiddio pobl ifanc, ac felly mae rhaid I ni hefyd buddsoddi yn ein pobl ifanc. Mae rhaid I ni fod yn barod I ariannu y gwaith gyda pobl ifanc, I fod yn siŵr eu bod nhw'n clywed neges wahanol, neges cariad Iesu Crist, neges cymod, neges eu bod nhw'n bwysig.
And as we've already said, we need to build our ability to read the Bible. And part of that is a commitment among the churches to theological education. And you might say, well, of course, we'd say that. And we would. But the truth is that at the moment, this is a very, very difficult time to be in theological education, because on the whole, churches are moving away from that, partly because of cost, but also because of wanting to prioritize other things. But how are we going to respond to people who read the Bible in the way in which far-right groups do? Well, the only way we can do that is if we learn to do it in a better way.
Mae'r pwynt ola wedyn, mae rhaid I ni gofio ein hanes ni, a dysgu oddi wrth ein hanes ni. Os mae'n dweud yna, mae dissenting traditions, mae llawer o ddwythinau, mae traddodiad da ni, I sefyll yn erbyn camdrin o pwer. Felly, mae rhaid I ni just cofio pwy ydyn ni.
We haven't had very long. We've just given a quick sort of overview of some ideas that hopefully have stimulated your interest. If you'd like to take it further, there are a number of publications that are coming out at the moment, partly because there is a wider recognition that this is an issue. And two that we would recommend are this book by, we've referred to already, Helen Painter and Maria Power, The Church, the Far Right and the Claim to Christianity.
Ac wedyn, Hannah Stroman ac Ulrich Schmiedel wedi ysgrifennu The Claim to Christianity Responding to the Far Right, a ni wedi defnyddio llawer o syniadau Stroman a Schmiedel yn y sgwrs yma. Felly, dyna diwedd y sgwrs. Dwi ddim yn siŵr os hi eisiau gofyn cwestiwn yna gwneud unrhyw sylwadau. Diolch yn fawr iawn.